Getting into the world of comic books has become easier and, in many ways, cheaper than ever before. And that's due in large parts to the variety of forms that comic books come in. They come in trade paperbacks and hardcovers that you can find in bookstores. Recently, they even come in cheap manga-sized editions to cater to an even wider audience. On the digital side of things, we have subscription services that give readers access to almost every comic from a specific publisher, digital bundles that let us read full series or a majority of an author's bibliography, and web comics that are completely free to read. And if you can't purchase digital or physical comics because of your financial situation, there's a huge chance you'll be able to find what you want online for free. And yet, despite all the cheap and convenient forms of comic books that exist today, these slim, expensive monthly comics have somehow survived the test of time. Periodical print media like newspapers and magazines barely exist anymore, but somehow these monthly comic books are able to attract a readership large enough to sustain thousands of specialty shops across the world. Why is that? What is it about monthly comic books that makes them so special? And how has the industry managed to sustain itself despite years of economic, technological, and cultural change? Before I talk about how the business of single issues manages to survive, I want to illustrate to you just how expensive following a monthly comic book series is. While there's no way to find out the average price of a single issue in 2025, the site ICV2 can give us a good estimate. In July 2025, based on the site's point of sale data gathered from 125 comic book stores, the average price of the top 51 comics sold that month was $4.97, which to me feels about right. Most single issues featuring mainline Marvel and DC superheroes retail at $4.99, with first issue sometimes even costing $5.99, which is crazy. Meanwhile, most floppies published under Image Comics are usually sold at an awesome price point of $3.99. Side note, have you guys been reading The Seasons by Rick Remender and Paul Azucena? This is a whimsical horror comic about four sisters named after seasons that is set in this colorful and vibrant world that feels like a cross between Alice in Wonderland and Studio Ghibli. It has heart, intrigue, and a ton of crazy art that'll blow your freaking socks off. And because it's an Image comic, each issue only costs $3.99. But while The Seasons may be a bargain compared to other comics, some might question its value considering the other forms of entertainment that exist out there. $4 to $5 for 20 pages of graphic literature that can be read in 15 minutes doesn't seem like a good deal compared to what you can get for the same price outside of comics. A $10 movie ticket gives you 2 hours of entertainment, and a $60 video game can take players tens and sometimes even hundreds of hours to complete. Not to mention that today is an age full of free media. Kids today have Roblox and Fortnite, free game platforms filled with seas of content so deep that no single player can experience everything in them. The internet gives us access to YouTube, Wikipedia, Reddit, Instagram, and TikTok, digital spaces where we can lose hours of our time diving deep into rabbit holes and scrolling ourselves to death. When you take into consideration the cheap and free entertainment available today, the success of single-issue comics seems even more surprising. Back in the 1930s, when the industry first emerged, comics were dirt cheap. Famous Funnies issue 1, one of the first periodical comics released on newsstands, had 68 pages and was sold for 10 cents. Nearly all comic books during the golden age were cheap, which allowed the medium to gain a wide reach. But today, comic books are luxury items priced at a premium, so how the heck have they survived? On February 1, 2025, Donald Trump announced plans to implement 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, along with an additional 10% tariff on goods from China. The next day, Rich Johnston of Bleeding Cool released an article titled comic books set to rocket in price next week over tariffs. The article covered the effect America's tariff on Canadian goods would have on the comic book industry. Since most single issues are printed in Canada, the 25% tariff would force publishers to raise prices, likely eliminating the $3.99 comic altogether. But amidst the article's dour discussion on the potential doom that lay ahead, a line about the economics of comic books caught my attention. A line so revelatory it was seared into my brain the very moment I read it. Comic books are generally an inelastic good, which means that an increase in price will not lead to a commensurate drop in demand. This blew my freaking socks off. I did not know that comics were an inelastic good. And this, my friends, is the key to understanding the comic book industry's stability. How has the single issue survived over the decades despite its surge in price? It's because they are an inelastic good. That is our answer. Now, what is an inelastic good? An inelastic good is a good with inelastic demand. If you were to change the price of an inelastic good, demand would not be affected to the same degree as the change in price. So if you're a bit confused, I'll illustrate this further with an example. A common example of an inelastic good I learned in school was drinking water. We all need drinking water to survive, and so if the price of water goes up by 10%, most of us wouldn't change our consumption habits. Even if the price of water went up by 100%, most of us wouldn't be able to cut our consumption of water in half. There is a base level of drinking water we need for us to live. So if water becomes more expensive, we have no choice but to continue consuming it. And if water becomes much cheaper, our consumption of it wouldn't change much either. Most people wouldn't go, oh, the price of water is much cheaper now, it's time to drink twice or thrice what I usually drink. It's not something most people would think about. Common examples of inelastic goods are the consumables that we need in order to live out our day-to-day lives. Toothpaste, rice, medicine, and gasoline. A change in prices of these items would lead to a relatively smaller change in demand because we pretty much need these things to live our normal lives. On the other end of the spectrum, we have elastic goods, which are price-sensitive products. Changing the price of an elastic good leads to a sharp change in demand. Some elastic goods that come to mind are luxury bags, high-end GPUs, and toys. Not only are these products less necessary than those mentioned earlier, but they have a ton of substitutes. You don't need the fanciest bag or the most powerful gaming rig. You can just buy a normal bag and a mid-tier PC. It's only when those luxury items are heavily discounted that most consumers would turn their attention to them, and demand for them would increase significantly. I thought single-issue comics were in this category. It seems like they belong with luxury items, and toys are another category of goods with elastic demand. Heck, even Google's AI overview thinks so. But alas, with many assumptions, I and AI are sorely mistaken, because things are almost always more complicated than they initially seem to be. See, there are a ton of factors that determine whether a product has elastic or inelastic demand, and there are so many different types of goods that target different demographics that determining price elasticity via face value analysis isn't always going to work. When we go back to the example of luxury goods, some individuals argue that they have inelastic demand, because brands like Rolex and Kate Spade cater to affluent individuals whose financial decisions are not affected by price. A change in the price of these items might not affect sales all that much. Rare collectibles, relics, and artifacts might not seem like the typical inelastic good, but they are. While they're not created by popular brands, it might not mean much to the average person. They are some of the most expensive things on earth because of their rarity and historical significance. Anyway, comics, as it turns out, are one of these atypical inelastic goods. And if you're looking for proof, Well, here it is. Based on Comicron's sales data of the top 300 comics every month, and the monthly average price of comics over the years, I created this graph right here. This graph depicts the relationship between the number of single issues sold and their average cover price from the years 2000 to 2019. As you can see, while the average price of single issue comics steadily increased over the years, comic book sales stayed pretty much the same. I mean, there are years like 2001 and 2010 when the price hike coincided with a dip in sales, but for the most part, the increase in the price of a single issue comic didn't decrease sales. The performance of the comic book industry during this period of time seems to be extremely stable, with sales not moving much despite the increase in price. Using the price elasticity of demand formula, we can also measure whether a good has elastic or inelastic demand. If you have data on a product's price and sales at two different moments in time, you can apply this formula yourself to measure a product's elasticity. In our case, I compared the sales and average price of comic books in the years 2000 and 2019. Between those 2 years, the average price of single issues increased from $2.95 to $4.14, a 40.34% increase. But the unit sales did not fall. Instead, sales grew from 69.26 million in 2000 to 76.92 million in 2019, an 11% increase. When we use the price elasticity of demand formula, which is a product's percentage change in quantity demanded over its percentage change in price, we get a value of 0.27, which means that modern single issues are indeed an inelastic good. For context, if you get a value of less than 1, then the good is inelastic. So yeah, in this case, we get a value very much below 1. So comic books seem to be an inelastic good. From my surface level research and analysis, almost all signs point to that being true, of monthly comic books having inelastic demand. Still, I understand if you find all this really weird. I found it weird too. In theory, when you consider the fact that monthly comics are luxury products that potentially have many substitutes in the form of video games, streaming services, and even digital comic books, they should be elastic, price-sensitive goods. An increase in the price of monthly comics should cause sales to fall off a cliff. But they haven't. So how did monthly comic books end up being categorized as inelastic goods, grouped with necessities like gasoline for vehicles and insulin for diabetes patients? What has caused comics to have such stable demand despite years of gradual price hikes? There are many different factors that determine whether a good has inelastic or elastic demand, but there are 3 main factors that I want to talk about in relation to comics, and they were highlighted in Jason Wood's 2010 blog post titled "Ralph Did Me Effect: Why We've Stuck Around for $3.99 Comics," which you have to read if you really enjoyed this video. It tackles pretty much the same topic, but through the lens of a 2010 comic book fan who saw the price of single issues surge to $3.99, 2 years after a global financial crisis ruined many people's livelihoods. Anyway, the article details the different factors as to why we've stuck around despite the increase in price, and shining a light on some of these factors will lead to the video's main thesis: availability of substitute goods. One major factor that determines a product's elasticity is whether consumers can find cheaper alternatives to that particular product. The fact that modern comic books are inelastic goods means that for existing comic book collectors, there is no close substitute for this art form in this format. While movies, television, novels, video games, and even webcomics are cheaper forms of entertainment that could be seen as substitutes for single issues, the inelastic demand for them over the years suggests that comic book fans don't view other art forms as replacement for comics. And in my experience with the community, that's true. Most of the comic book fans that I know have been fans for years, and those of them who collect single issues have accumulated boxes and boxes of them as a result of years of dedicated collecting. Of course, some of them have taken breaks buying them or left them altogether, but generally, people who collect single issue comics stick with the hobby for at least a few years before they quit. There's a novelty in visiting a specialty shop regularly to catch up on the latest comics. There's something special about following an illustrated story in a physical format for years on end. Even going beyond people who collect monthly comics, most comic book fans I know love comics specifically and treat it as a distinct art form separate from other types of media. To most readers, there's something about the art form that sets it apart from the rest, something that can't be replaced by an interactive experience in virtual reality or a cinematic narrative on a screen. And that's one factor as to why comic book sales have remained steady for a long time despite the rise in price. To most fans, there is nothing quite like comics. Brand loyalty. Okay, this is not that great of a factor. Brand loyalty can put consumers under a spell to continue purchasing their products despite price hikes and dips in quality, and Jason Wood in his blog highlights it as a major factor that makes comic books an inelastic good. And I am definitely agreeing with him here. A lot of us have an allegiance to certain brands and characters, and sometimes our loyalty is taken advantage of by these companies. But I don't think we're just loyal to companies and their intellectual properties. On a positive note, I think we follow writers and artists just as much as we do brands. Comic books are created by a small enough team that each creative's impact on a book is noticeable. Each comic book creative becomes a brand in themselves with their distinct art style or unique way of writing, cultivating a fan base that will support their projects till the very end. It's very common for creators of superhero comic books to launch their own independent projects and continue their stream of success in a space all to themselves. So yeah, it's because of our loyalty to brands and by extension creators of comics that the industry manages to perform consistently despite rising prices. Necessity. Most people would say comic books are a luxury and unnecessary, but Marvel, DC, and others count on we diehards feeling otherwise. For us, our comic book fix is as necessary as cigarettes for a smoker. That's not a very positive analogy, but for some, maybe it's the one they need. Comic books are not a physiological need in order to survive, but the consistent sales numbers show that a lot of us treat single issues like a necessity. For financially struggling comic book collectors, I hope that this point is a reminder that you should be controlling your hobby, and not letting your hobby control you. But also, comic book fans treating comics like a necessity can be seen as a pretty cool thing too. Our unwavering financial support for single-issue comics could represent how important art is in our personal lives. Its major role in helping us cope with tough times, molding our character, and introducing us to new ideas and perspectives. The importance of art in human life and society is something that continues to be heavily debated on in educational circles, public administration, and online forums. I'm not exactly sure how much public funding should be dedicated to the art sector, but comic book fans needing their fix of comics prompts us to reevaluate the necessity of art and entertainment in society. Maybe art shouldn't be a luxury. Maybe art is needed for all of us to truly live. We love comics. By exploring the inelastic demand of comic books and the factors behind fans' unflinching support of them, we get to see just how passionate the comic book community is, and how much comic books mean to us. That's actually why I wanted to create this video. I wanted to use sales data to tell a really sweet and heartwarming story. Comic books are an inelastic good because we don't see any other substitute for them, are loyal to the creators of our favorite stories, and treat the medium as a necessity for our well-being and survival. For comic book creators, I hope that this video is comforting for you. The comic book community might be small, but we're in it for the long haul. Some of us will take breaks and even quit due to unforeseen circumstances, but most of us will continue to love this medium one way or another throughout our entire lives. But the inelastic demand for single issues doesn't tell a purely positive story. It's also indicative of a demographic that the medium has lost over the years, a readership base that single issues no longer caters to. The fact that single issue sales aren't heavily affected by their consistently rising price means that kids, a very price-sensitive demographic, aren't really into them anymore. Toys for children are generally elastic goods and are usually set at an affordable price. An article from Business Insider in 2023 points out that toys in the United States have become cheaper over time due to an increased reliance on overseas production. What I want to highlight here is that instead of increasing the price of toys alongside inflation, companies like Hasbro and Mattel have kept their prices competitive because they know that significant price hikes to their products could significantly damage their sales numbers. Kids are not rich, and even if they come from a family with plenty of disposable income, they might not be allowed to buy a ton of toys. So if you want to get a hold of children's attention and money, you have to set your product at a price they can afford. Now, comics used to be an affordable, elastic good. In David Palmer's journal article for the 2010 edition of Advances in Business Research that documented the evolution of the American comic book industry, I found this incredible table that records the cover price of Action Comics from 1938 to 2000, along with several other details like the amount of pages in each version of the book and its real price when adjusted for inflation. Now, turning this into a graph, and oh my gosh, look at how stable comic book prices used to be. From 1938 to 1961, Action Comics retailed at 10 cents an issue. If comics were that cheap today, I would have a way bigger pull list than I have right now. Anyway, it's evident from this graph that publishers couldn't increase prices during the 1940s and 50s, most likely because comics were an elastic good targeting the price-sensitive demographic that was kids. In order to maintain profitability, DC Comics instead reduced the amount of pages Action Comics had over time, a method we now call shrinkflation. And that's why the modern comic is a 32-page adventure focusing on a single character or team, rather than being a 64-page collection of different stories. We also know that comic books were an elastic good in the 1940s and 50s because of an experiment that Dell Comics conducted. In the 1950s, Dell Comics was the biggest publisher in the business, selling millions of licensed kids comics a month that featured characters like Uncle Scrooge, Felix the Cat, the Flintstones, Charlie Brown, Tom and Jerry, Bugs Bunny, and more. At its peak in 1953, the company claimed to be selling 26 million copies each month, a sales figure that publishers today only dream of making. Now, with Dell Comics being the industry leader, you'd think they would have a ton of power and that they could increase the price of their comics without a significant drop in sales. But from Glenn Hubbard and Tony O'Brien's blog post, Shrinkflation and the Comic Book Industry, we see that that isn't the case. In 1957, the firm's managers decided to use a market experiment to gather data on the price elasticity of demand. In most cities, Dell kept the price of its comics at 10 cents, but in some cities it sold the identical comics at a price of 15 cents. The experiment lasted from March 1957 to August 1958, when the company discontinued it by reverting to selling all of its comics for 10 cents. Although we lacked the data necessary to compare the sales of Dell Comics with a 15-cent price to the sales of Dell Comics with a 10-cent price, the fact that no other publisher raised its prices during that period and that Dell abandoned the experiment indicates that the demand curve for Dell's comics was price elastic. The percentage decline in the quantity sold was greater than the 50% increase in price. So Dell's revenue from sales in the cities selling comics with a price of 15 cents likely declined. So comics really were an elastic good in the golden age. Publishers couldn't increase their prices even if they wanted to. It was just unprofitable for them back then. But as discussed earlier, the modern comic book industry does not have this problem. Comics today are an inelastic good. Last year, the best-selling comics were Ultimate Spider-Man issue 1, which retailed at $5.99, and Absolute Batman issue 1, which retailed at $4.99. We're at a point where comics can be priced at a premium and it wouldn't affect sales all that much. And it's because kids are not the main demographic that single-issue comics cater to anymore. The average age of comic collectors has gotten older over time. Is it a problem caused by the industry? It could be, but I don't think so. The entertainment landscape has just changed so much that single-issue comics can't be as prominent of a cultural force anymore. When comic books became mass media in the late 1930s, they only had to compete with candy, broadcast radio, and the cinema. Today, kids just have so much entertainment they can access for free. They have Fortnite and Roblox and YouTube and a $4 single issue that can be read in 15 to 20 minutes. Just can't compete with these entertainment juggernauts. Even if the price of comic books were brought down to $1, I don't think children would rush to shops to buy them. Of course, there will always be youngsters falling in love with comic books and buying single issues, but their time in the spotlight of the young generation is over. It's been over for quite a while, and we have this price inelasticity of demand to show for it. When I hold a modern single-issue comic in my hands, I'm kind of amazed that it exists. Based on the price of a single issue and the available forms of cheap entertainment out there, this shouldn't exist. But because of the love of fans who go to comic shops every month, and the love of creators who pour their entire being into making irreplaceable artistic masterpieces through these flimsy floppies, the comic book industry has been able to stay afloat after all of these years. But the way that the industry sustained itself today, through high prices and a reliance on a small, dedicated fanbase, is a reminder that the era of monthly comics being affordable mass media for the younger generation is long gone. Analyzing what sustains the comic book industry today reveals a bittersweet tale of current love and past loss. And it's a tale that I will continue to think about whenever I pick up the latest comics. My name is Joshua C, and I will see you in the next one.